Welcome to this edition of our weekly webinar series sponsored by the Committee on the Present Danger China. It involves our running analyses and commentaries on what we think of as evidence of China's unrestricted warfare under the control, of course, of the Chinese Communist Party and the damage that it is doing to the United States of America, to its vital national security and other interests, as well as more generally, the challenge that such behavior represents to the free world more generally. We're going to be talking in this program about an issue that we have touched on repeatedly in recent months. As the government of Great Britain, under the premiership of Sir Kier Starmer, has worked to engineer one of the most disastrous feats of diplomacy on, I think, the recorded history, namely a deal in which the Brits would turn over to an African nation, Mauritius, the Chagos Islands, 1,200 miles away in the Indian Ocean, and in so doing, set the stage for, inevitably, problems for the U.S. military base on one of those islands, Diego Garcia. In previous programs, we have explained, as we will do again to some extent today, the vital importance of Diego Garcia to American power projection throughout the Indo-Pacific region, really, but specifically in parts of the world like, well, the Middle East, where, as President Trump made clear in a Truth Social post yesterday, if the United States has to use military force against Iran, Diego Garcia will play a very central role in our ability to do just that. The president, of course, was making some rather important other points as well in this post. And again, we've set the stage for our discussion of what he's just done and what comes next with, at least as I recall, two other programs in which we've been told that the government of the United States was in favor of this deal, despite its obvious shortcomings, to put it mildly. And subsequently, we talked about the fact that the president had rightly described what Kier Starmer is doing with Mauritius as an act of, quote, great stupidity, unquote. That set the stage, one would have thought, for the rejection of this deal by the United States. But lo and behold, on Tuesday of this week, as we're speaking, the State Department issued a press statement to the effect that they were sending off a delegation to negotiate with Mauritius certain understandings about how this would all work if the Brits surrendered Diego Garcia specifically to Mauritius. And oh, by the way, one must note they were going to pay billions of dollars for the privilege of surrendering this island and the rest of the Chagos, which gave rise to a further concern, namely that under the terms of the deal that the Brits had negotiated, any even brief hiccup in the payment of those subventions would result in the termination of the deal and presumably the end of our ability to make use of Diego Garcia. This was of profound concern, I think it's fair to say, to those of us on the Committee on the Present Danger of China, particularly those of us who were among the 80 or so individuals with varying degrees of prominence and expertise and direct knowledge of the Diego Garcia strategic value that very strongly encouraged President Trump not to go along with this deal and to tell the Brits that it was a no-go. What happened, though, yesterday, and it prompted this rather hastily arranged webinar, is that the President of the United States not only made the point that I mentioned a moment ago about the vital need for Diego Garcia in connection with any action in the offing with respect to Iran, but he flat out said to Kier Starmer in capital letters, no less, in this Truth Social post, do not give away Diego Garcia. Unfortunately, the question occurs, will the State Department continue to try to undermine the president and his position on Diego Garcia, or perhaps simply complicate enormously the ability we need to have to make full use of that naval and Air Force asset by virtue of allowing Mauritius to control the rest of the Chagos and thereby invite in the Chinese Communist Party, which has its hooks pretty firmly set into this nation of Mauritius, a point that will be made here momentarily by one of our eminent guests, Colonel Grant Newsham. Suffice it to say that where we find ourselves at the moment is apparently this delegation the State Department wants to send to Mauritius to negotiate about the British deal and its knock-on effects is still a go. Our very strong hope is that that will be like the idea of giving away Diego Garcia, countermanded by the commander-in-chief, and that will happen right quick. We're going to explore all of these points and their strategic importance with a very interesting group of people, including, I'm hopeful, an individual who actually hails from the Chagos Islands, as well as one or more of our British colleagues who have been closely following and actively opposing this benighted deal. And we are also going to discuss a bit about what the very fact that Britain, which I think is at the present moment once again deserving of the quite damning name given to it about 2 centuries ago, namely Perfidious Albion, will continue to be worthy of access to the most sensitive national security secrets of the United States, and specifically our intelligence, as part of the so-called Five Eyes arrangement. A lot to talk about in short, and we're going to start with a pre-recorded interview that I did earlier today for our Securing America program with our Committee on the Present Danger China colleague and champion of the efforts we are making as a committee to resist the CCP and its efforts to take down our country and, in fact, the rest of the free world as well. He is the author, Colonel Grant Newsham, of a tremendously timely and best-selling book, When China Attacks, A Warning to America. Let's go to the videotape with Colonel Newsham.
I was pleased yesterday to see Mr. Trump actually speak in such clear terms, saying, no, we're not going to give it away. You shouldn't either. Although, while one takes satisfaction from that, you kind of have to wait and see what comes next. Unfortunately, because we've seen several shifts in Mr. Trump's response to this over the last year when he first met Prime Minister Starmer and said he understood the deal and was okay with it. Then a year later, he said it was colossal stupidity. And then a week after that, he said, well, it's the best deal he can get, and I understand. And now he says, forget about it. I'm hoping this is the last word. The importance of Diego Garcia is obvious. It'd be the equivalent of giving up our bases in Hawaii and thinking we're going to operate in the Asia Pacific. That's how important it is for operations in the Indian Ocean and also up into the Middle East, over to Africa, to the east side of the Indian Ocean, into the Pacific. It really performs a connecting role as well. And we can operate just about anything from their aircraft carriers to B-2s to B-52s. You cannot overstate the importance of this. The fact that we're even considering the possibility of letting the English turn this over to Mauritius is insane. It shouldn't have even got this far. And make no mistake, somebody dropped the ball on this. The British regime or the administration of Kier Starmer, they do not act like our friends. They act more like China's friends. And if you talk about this enough, you kind of assume everybody knows all the specifics. But when it comes to Mauritius, back to that, if the British hand the Chagos archipelago, including Diego Garcia, over to Mauritius with the promise of a 99-year lease, well, the Chinese have their claws into Mauritius. They will make short work of that. And before long, you will have Mauritius causing us all sorts of trouble. You will see Chinese businessmen building resorts on some of the other islands near Diego Garcia. Research vessels are going to show up. The Chinese fishing fleet's going to park itself there. And suddenly, Diego Garcia is a lot harder to use than it once was. And that is as sure to happen as anything. And the British government knows this, but I don't think they care. I think some of the reasoning behind their move here, their just unnatural insistence on turning Diego Garcia over to Mauritius, is to do China a favor. These guys have very close ties to the PRC, particularly the National Security Advisor of Starmer's administration, Jonathan Powell. He has a consultancy, and it has had some fairly deep ties with the PRC. He's probably looking at some more business from this, quite possibly. And he's like a character out of that old British comedy show, Yes Minster. Starmer himself, well, he just approved the building of a huge new embassy in London that the Chinese will use for spying, intimidation, and really to demonstrate their domination over the British government as well. He approved that, despite all sorts of local opposition. His administration allowed the espionage cases against 2 parliamentary staffers to collapse. They basically not just did nothing, they actually made it so that those collapsed. And now the British administration is talking about letting Chinese companies come into London, into the UK, and raise capital without having to meet the normal accounting standards everyone else does. He just went to Beijing. He humiliated himself. He kowtowed to the Chinese. And something very abnormal is going on when it comes to the British. One suspects that part of this is an intentional effort really to assist the PRC by taking the Americans down a notch. And that is not far-fetched. That's not the stuff of spy novels. This is actually a long-term ally, which appears intent on betraying us. And then there's the good old normal corruption in this deal, where the chief legal counsel to the Mauritius negotiating team with the UK is a close friend of Kier Starmer. And he's said to have made some millions out of this deal. So one hardly knows what to say. But if this is a good ally, well, one wonders how much worse allies there are. But why should we continue to have a Five Eyes relationship with them? And Five Eyes refers to the intelligence collection, intelligence sharing arrangement we have with the Australians, New Zealand, Canada, and the UK. At some point, you have to wonder if what we're providing is going directly to the Chinese. That is how big an act of betrayal this handover to Mauritius is. Additionally, the British though perhaps not surprisingly, are betraying the Chagosian people themselves, who have no connection to Mauritius, want nothing to do with the place, have been loyal British subjects and want to stay that way, and now they're being handed over. It tells you something about the UK, and I would also note to understand the context of this, and why Mr. Trump really ought to recognize that he should not change his mind again, is consider the British track record. Look at Hong Kong. If you're old enough and remember it, well, it was the British who said, we got a deal. It's going to be great. There's no problems. Don't worry. Trust us. And they had a deal that they signed in 1984 to hand Hong Kong over to China in 1997. The Chinese promised in writing that they would let Hong Kong preserve its freedoms for 50 years, so 2047, or quite a while. And almost immediately, the Chinese started to snuff out Hong Kong's freedoms, and by 2017, they just scoffed and said the treaty is a dead letter. And China has now got its claws, not just in Hong Kong, but it is suffocating the freedoms that it once had. The British response, a lot of hand-wringing, but couldn't be helped. But remember, they said, trust us. And also the guy, one of the people involved in that turnover, Jonathan Powell, well, that's the aforementioned National Security Advisor for Kier Starmer. And then if you need further references, we'll go to Zimbabwe. In late 79, early 80, the British they cut a deal with the relevant parties to hand Zimbabwe over really to the head of the main guerrilla group. And they said, well, don't worry, we'll take care of things. We can control Robert Mugabe, and nothing to worry about. Well, and there were good options at the time besides that. Well, they did it, and they said, trust us. Well, within a few years, Mugabe had killed 20,000 Matabele tribesmen and went on for the next 37 years to loot the country and maintain his power by murder, intimidation, and corruption. The British response, oh, nothing to worry about. Trust us. Well, Trump should know, and he's been in enough real estate deals with shady, desperate characters. He should know what the British are trying to do to him here, and that's pull a fast one on him. And if hopefully President Trump does not back down, does not change his mind or try to be too clever by half. I'm told that it appears that a team from the State Department is actually going to Mauritius now to negotiate with the Mauritians. I don't know about what, but this is asking for trouble. And it appears to reflect an American consent that if we talk to people, we can become good friends with them, everything gets worked out. So I have a bad feeling about this, that maybe someone in the U.S. government, State Department, whomever, is going to try to undercut what President Trump has just said. And for whatever reason, it's just an act of stupidity from my perspective. So we know the importance of Diego Garcia. We should have no confidence in this British administration. And we know what their track record is when it comes to the words, trust us, sign here on the line. And Mr. Trump is a real estate man. He must recognize this. But to give Diego Garcia to Mauritius, this would be as stupid as when the Americans said they were going to use Afghan allies to get bin Laden in Tora Bora in 2001. It was that dumb. It'd be as dumb as ending the Gulf War too early before Saddam Hussein was actually defeated. This will be Donald Trump's Bagram Afghanistan giveaway if it continues. That's how serious this is.
Colonel Newsham, thank you. It is indeed all that serious and more, quite frankly. We are going to further explore what's going on here and specifically what is likely to be the next step of Keir Starmer's government with a British individual who has been involved in the Brexit issue and Chagos related issues in the British Parliament and political circles for about 15 years. His name is Christopher Howarth. He is the author of a novel on this subject, relating to the Chagosian archipelago at least, entitled The Durian Pact. We're very happy to have him on very short notice to give us your perspective on what His Majesty's government is up to with respect to this matter of parliamentary approval of the deal and the implications of what the President of the United States has just done, saying, again, in the most direct of ways, in capitals, no less, do not give away Diego Garcia.
Thank you very much for inviting me on. And I ought to start with a bit of an apology for Britain and the government, which I obviously don't support, on what they've been doing on the Chagos Islands, putting US and British security in some jeopardy by wanting to hand over British sovereign territory and bizarrely paying Mauritius, which has links to China, for the privilege of it, to the tune of many, many billions. I was first involved in this sort of several years ago when the idea of handing the territories over to Mauritius first appeared in the British media, and probably at that point it's probably fair to say not very many people knew where the Chagos Islands were, or their sort of vital strategic importance in the middle of the Indian Ocean. I perhaps was one of the very few that did, having the year before I wrote a novel about set in the future about an expansionist China, and had the Chagos Islands right in the middle of it as a crucial sort of link in a potential conflict with China. So at that point, when it turned up in the British Parliament, I've been involved in the parliamentary side to try and slow down and question every aspect of this deal. And the surprising thing to me, having gone all the way through the proceeds in Parliament, working with MPs in the Commons and in the debates in the Lords, every time we questioned the rationale, the legal rationale behind the deal, the rationale would change. So to start with, it was, we've had a binding opinion of the ICJ. We must hand over the territory to Mauritius. And you said, but it's not. It's an advisory opinion. And they said, oh well, yes, it is advisory, but it'll lead to a binding one. And then we said, but we have an opt-out. 2 Commonwealth countries under the ICJ can't sue each other in the ICJ. And they said, oh yes, that is true, but it wasn't that. It's binding on UN agencies. And you said, okay, well, which ones? And they said, the International Telecoms Union, and this will mean we can't use radio spectrum on the base. So looked up that and said, but we have a military opt-out from that. That doesn't work. And they said, oh, well, what we really meant was something entirely different. It was UNCLOS, and there could be a binding judgment under UNCLOS and the Annex 7 binding arbitration in the tribunal. So looked that up and said, but we've got a military opt-out from that as well. And then by the end of the Lords debates, they just said, well, we need the approval of other countries to use the base, so we're going to have to do the deal. It's all very secret, you know, you wouldn't understand. And it's like, well, go on. What is the rationale? And I came to the conclusion there is no rationale for it. It's sadly, it's a group of ideologically motivated politicians and lawyers within the British government who, for ideological reasons, don't like the idea of Britain having overseas territories or overseas bases and wish to hand it over. And it's manifested itself again this morning in this idea that international law should stop the British government using its bases, putting them at the disposal of America in the pursuit of trying to disarm Iran. So it's this ideological problem which we have in the UK, and I believe is shared to a much smaller extent in the US. Ideologically motivated lawyers, often working for third countries. So we had Philip Sands and Hermer and their links to Mauritius, pursuing an agenda that is contrary to UK and US security. So that was why I got involved in it. And having been involved in the Brexit debates in Parliament, I learned a few of the tricks of the trade of how to slow things down, working with MPs and others. And we formed a team to slow that down, and then we came up with the idea of another way to halt the transfer of the land is to go back to the very beginning of the problem, which was the removal of the Chagosian people from the Chagosian archipelago, which allowed the government to say there was no right of self-determination because no one lived there. So we thought we would solve that problem for them by with the help of Adam Holloway and a boat setting off from Thailand via Sri Lanka. They landed a few days ago on in the Chagos archipelago on one of the outer islands away from the base. And they've been there for the last few days. And we now have Chagosians who were born on the Chagos Islands, living on the Chagos Islands, demanding self-determination to remain British. And they are very much supporters of the base, British sovereignty, and pro-American. So the solution to all of these legal problems, which was a manufactured problem, is to allow the Chagosians, the pro-British, pro-American Chagosians, onto the Chagos Islands, then under customary international law, a recognized people with the right to self-determination, have the right to decide their future, and they want to decide their future to remain British and to keep the base, which secures it in international law, and it's also morally the right thing to do by the Chagosian people who were removed in the 1970s from the island to make way for the base. So it's been a lively many months, and we're very grateful that the President of the United States has now made his opinion very clear on the future of the Chagos Islands, that they should remain British, that handing them over in return for a lease, which has all sorts of problems with it, which we highlighted in Parliament, problems with encroachment onto the outer islands, potentially by China, problems in the lease where Britain has to notify Mauritius of its use of the islands, any number of other problems with the lease. We're very glad that the President has said no, and in Britain we can now move forwards to a better solution, which will be the settlement of the island by the pro-British Chagosians, a new form of government, and that would solve the problem internationally and in international law, sort of in the same way to solutions being looked at in sort of Micronesia and other territories. For Guam, we have another base, a very important base in Cyprus, which, if the precedent of the Chagos Islands would follow, the very important NSA GCHQ listening station on sovereign British territory in Cyprus. It's exactly the same legal issue. Cyprus was made independent, but Britain kept back the sovereign base areas, which are vital as a listening post for the Middle East. So in a world where there's lawfare, politically motivated lawyers doing political campaigns to undermine British and American bases, it's very important, in my opinion, that we win the battle for the Chagos Islands, because if we allow that one to go, the next one will be Cyprus, and then after that there's Guam and any other base, because this is a political campaign by opponents of people who do not want Britain or America to have overseas bases and don't have the same view on Western security and sort of global threats to the West that I suspect many of your listeners do.
I'm anxious to get some clarity on procedurally where you think things stand in the UK. This is obviously a sovereign nation. It is free to make deals with other sovereign nations. And yet we would like to think that the importance of the U.S. use of that base in Diego Garcia is recognized by His Majesty's government now, that they would think afresh about the advisability of going forward with this arrangement over the very direct objections of President Trump. What are your thoughts as to how this is likely to play out, sir?
Legally speaking, it's a British territory and has been a British territory since 1812. They have signed an agreement with Mauritius to hand over the islands to Mauritius, which became independent from Britain in the 1960s. That agreement is not in force. It's just signed, but in the agreement in Article 18, it says that it can't come into force until other measures have happened, including going through Parliament. Now, it hasn't finally finished going through Parliament. It's gone through the House of Commons stage, and it's got to the House of Lords, who have sent a range of amendments back, which I helped draft, to the Commons. And we're in a process called parliamentary ping pong, where amendments.
That's the technical term for it.
That is the technical term. It's grown up over time. So you have an amendment in one house that's sent to the other, and if the other house disagrees with it, they send it back, and you go backs and forwards until either one side gives in, or you agree that you won't have agreement, and the legislation falls. So we're in that process, and we were expecting it to reappear next week for the next round of ping pong, which it gets more and more difficult as it goes along. And then, of course, the president made his announcement, and they've postponed the hearing that was the sitting for next Tuesday, which was going to be the next round of it, rather hoping
in the Lords?
In the Lords. So rather hoping it's been postponed indefinitely or forever. And if it's postponed until May, it's the end of our parliamentary session, and then there's a gap, and then there's a King's speech. And at that point, for technical reasons, this bill would come to an end if it hasn't been fully passed. So we're trying our best to delay it till May, which would effectively kill it. But hopefully, now the president has made his views known, they won't bring it back, because the United States has a veto on the matter, because there is a prior existing agreement with the UK with the US in 1966 that allowed the US to use the base, and this runs until 2036. And under that prior existing agreement, the UK promises to keep sovereignty of the base. So if the US says we're very happy with our 1966 agreement and don't want it to change, then this handover can't go ahead. The Biden administration and the prior iteration was the British were negotiating with America to update that agreement to take into account the surrender of sovereignty, but the US does not have to agree with that. So now the president has made his mind known on it. If the US sticks to that position, the transfer of sovereignty can't go ahead, but it remains under British sovereignty, and it remains exactly as it is, which would be the preferable outcome from my point of view.
I guess if you were making book on all of this, what do you think is the likelihood that either you will be able to, stave off this disastrous deal from going through the House of Lords and to a satisfactory conclusion to the government, and thereby, enabling them to move forward over the U.S. objections?
As you've been following it, it's been a roller coaster of a campaign for the last number of months. So we thought we had won on about 3 occasions previously, and each time it unravelled. So the last time it sort of unravelled, we got on a plane to Washington to talk to the State Department and talk to Senator Kennedy and various other people in the Capitol, and went through all of the UK arguments that they'd put forwards and explained why they were all basically nonsense, and the UK government had been spinning a story to the US government, and I went through it all in meticulous detail, as I sort of explained a bit earlier, the different opt-outs and why the government doesn't have to do this. And I think that had some effect, because it meant the State Department they understood the ammunition they had to fire back at our Foreign Office. So actually, when you say that, don't you realize there's an opt-out? And of course they can't go back on that because it's true. So we've lobbied in. It's a sort of a multi. There's lots of moving parts. There was the Washington side, which we tried our best to lobby on. There was the UK Parliament side, where we were trying to slow down this bill going through Parliament, which we've had quite a lot of success. But it gets more difficult the longer you delay if the government is determined. At the moment, we were reasonably hopeful that we could continue to delay it anyway, because at the moment we've got the support of the minor party, the Liberal Democrats, who are quite powerful in the Lords. And as long as they stuck with it, we could delay in the Lords. And of course, there was the sort of there was the Chagosian angle as well. So in the background, been working on this plan which was rather a fallback plan, to sort of take the matters into our own hands by landing a group of Chagosians on the island, which would, in my mind, was the sort of one of our trump cards that could scupper the deal by having a permanent settlement of Chagosians on the islands, Britain is then in a very difficult position if they want to hand them over to Mauritius, because they've got an open problem. What do? They can't really arrest them in the full light of TV cameras, go onto the islands with the army and arrest them and deport them and put them on, because they did that in the 70s, and public opinion wouldn't really put up with doing it for a second time. So they can't remove them, and they can't really hand the islands over with a group of Chagosians on it who want to remain British, because you're handing them straight over to Mauritius that doesn't really like the Chagosian people, and the Chagosian people reciprocate by not particularly liking the Mauritians. And the Mauritians have already said they want to arrest them all and presumably put them in prison. So the British government can't really hand over British citizens to Mauritius that wants to jail them, and they can't remove them. So this was the sort of spanner in the works that we've been planning for months to try and slow it down and hopefully scupper the handover altogether. And Adam Holloway, whose phone is just charging, will hopefully come onto it. He masterminded this hiring a boat in Thailand and going in radio silence for 3,000 miles via Sri Lanka and coming into the Chagos Islands from a direction that the British and American patrol boats wouldn't have suspected, and they managed to do it perfectly, landing without anyone noticing until a few days later, when they sent a patrol boat into the Peros Panos lagoon and spotted them, and they've been served with eviction notices, which they've promptly appealed and are going to ignore in any event. So there's a permanent settlement of Chagosians using their right to self-determination. They've elected their own leader. We organised an election of the diaspora community before they set off. So we've got a very, very surprisingly done. We've got an interim government in exile that has a democratic mandate from the Chagosians. They're on the Chagos Islands. They are administering their admittedly small settlement. They fulfil all the requirements to be under international law to stay there. So that's our sort of legal case, which we're going to publish a report on later on, how the British government should now take this on board and actually build a proper settlement there, a village, a small overseas settlement along the lines of, there's a number of them around the world, the Pitcairn Islands or Ascension Island, these small self-governing territories, jurisdictions that are where Britain looks after the defence and foreign policy, but they administer themselves. And like the Falkland Islands, essentially, they're all very pro-British. They understand the role of sort of Britain in the world and security, and they would be a great asset to the base in our opinion. So it's always been, in my mind, the logical solution to how you solve the problems of you have no right to run the country, the territories, but that's what the people want, and they do. So that's the solution we were offering to these legal issues that that have been thrown up by Mauritius and their British-based lawyers.
Our team, the Committee on the Present Danger of China, and I think for Americans concerned about our national security, we deeply appreciate your daring do in all of this, your determination to conjure up whatever impediments to the collapse of Britain on this topic. I just want to say that your description of this British government attitude towards the Chagosians, it strikes me as, I guess the technical term for it is chutzpah, but the irony of what appears to be a surrender of this sovereign British territory to Mauritius as a means of somehow expiating guilt over past colonial activities by the British government. This would seem to be creating new colonial arrangements without regard for the preferences of the people who hail from the Chagos archipelago, and therefore all the more at odds with the vital interests of, well, the people who hail from there, but also, I would argue, of course, the United States as well. We have been joined, praise the Lord, by our friend Cleo Pascal, who has, as those of you who have been following this story know, been incredibly impactful in her efforts to raise an alarm about what's going on with Diego Garcia at the hands of the British government, and in particular, the threat that Colonel Newsham alluded to, that this would almost certainly translate into a series of predictable events that would ultimately result in the Chinese Communist Party being able to take over this incredibly important facility at Diego Garcia. Cleo, thank you. I'm so glad that Steve Bannon freed you from the batter's box there and allowed you to make some key points, I'm sure, with him and make some key points with us now. Thank you for your great work on all of these fronts, and we are so appreciative that you found time to give us your update on what has happened, and as importantly, whether what is in the offing next from folks who are carrying on the tradition of Perfidious Albion will undo what the president has very strongly insisted upon with respect to other islands in the Chagos archipelago. Over to you, my dear.
Thank you very much, Frank. And again, apologies for joining late. Frank has been on the forefront of covering this for months and months and months and months. And so people on here are fairly well briefed, especially now that we're getting reports from the front line, so to speak. I'm not sure what was reported in the UK Times has already been covered. So that to me is something that's fairly germane. The Times has reported that one of the reasons that Trump came out so forcefully in the tweet is because the UK has so far declined permission for the US to use mainland UK bases, including RAF Fairford, in Iran planning. That's where the U.S. heavy bombers are based, including for the ones that are sort of the primary U.S. bombers, heavy bomber base in Europe. And the arguments are similarly legalistic, although, again, similarly not sure if they would stand up to much scrutiny, especially combined with there were reports when the U.S. was bombing the narco boats that the U.K. was resisting sharing information with the U.S. then out of concerns over the legality of the bombing of the narco boats. And it's worth remembering, of course, that Prime Minister Kier Starmer is a human rights lawyer, and as are a lot of the people involved in this Chagos debacle. So I think that if the reporting in Times is true, that puts a whole other element to it that brings this far beyond Chagos and raises questions about the UK as a reliable partner in times of crisis, and especially in the context of Five Eyes. That additional concern has grown out of things like the granting of permission for that large Chinese embassy in a highly strategic location in London, and Prime Minister Kier Starmer's recent visit to China, where he was physically manhandled by one of the Chinese hosts in a move unlike anything I've seen in high-level diplomatic exchanges. Normally, the host would never physically touch a prime minister of a visiting country, let alone sort of physically shift him over. It just implies psychologically that the hosts have no fear of Prime Minister Starmer. And he came back from that visit with very little to show for it for the United Kingdom. But still banging on that Chinese drum, so to speak. A lot what's happened with Chagos is now it's one piece in a puzzle where we're starting to get more and more pieces coming together about how potentially compromised, if not just simply Beijing friendly, the current leadership in Beijing is. Now, the question is, if you get a change of government, do you get a change of approach? I'm not sure, because there also seems to have been a lot of support within the civil service for the Chagos surrender, as it's being called. And I wouldn't underestimate the sort of knee-jerk anti-Americanism that you're finding all over Europe and have for a long time. So again, as was described in the national security strategy, they were talking about, will Europe be Europe in 20 or 30 years? I'm not sure Europe is Europe now. And it's going to take a hard look, not just at things like Chagos, but at things like the French approach to New Caledonia and their territories and possessions in the Indian Ocean and otherwise in the Pacific. This is very evident now that when push comes to shove, the U.S. may be the one getting shoved by some of its allies at the most unexpected times. It's terrible for the people of Chagos that they're physically on the front line of this and are having to call our attention to it. But it's beyond time that our attention is called to it, and especially how it fits into this larger issue of where is the U.S. relationship with the U.K. now? Does the U.S. need to start looking at maybe more aligned partners like Japan when it comes to intelligence sharing? Just shaking things up a little bit and re-looking at the world through post-World War II and post-Cold War lenses.
Well, thank you. Two things that I just wanted to ask you about specifically. One is, could you amplify a little bit further on the role that the State Department was playing in all of this? Christopher and some of his colleagues were making a valiant effort to educate them about the true status of this whole accord and its implications for the United States. As recently as Tuesday of this week, they seem to have bought it hook, line, and sinker and pushed out the message that it was the official position of the United States government to approve this agreement and be willing to, live under it. The president clearly signaled otherwise the following day. But is state on board at this point, would you say? Is that likely? Or do you think that there may be some skullduggery afoot with respect at the minimum to these other islands of the archipelago? And can you give us a sense of how many there are? And you're the go-to gal on Indo-Pacific islands, so give us a quick geography lesson.
Okay, well, not when Christopher is on the line in terms of geography, but so the way the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea works is every island can get up to 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone around it and 12 nautical mile territorial seas if they're inhabited. And this sort of raises a whole bunch of questions about how the UK played the law by depopulating the islands and now saying that there's nobody there, and so you don't have to do all these things you'd have to do if somebody's there. So the law on that is mutable, but effectively they're south of the Maldives, so it's west of India and then south of India. And the Maldives, I don't know whether this has been covered yet, but the Maldives have recently claimed a piece of the Chagos exclusive economic zone. There were a couple of boats, they said, illegally fishing in waters that were contiguous to Maldivian waters in the Chagosian waters. And so they sent in Coast Guard and drones to detain them, and in the process said, we have control over these waters. So this is that sort of confusion and weakness makes everybody concerned, the Indians, the Maldivians, everybody. And so you can see people jockeying for position to secure what they think is in their own best interest, fully understandably. About State Department, I think that a lot of us are playing the game of what just happened, because it's so unusual to get a statement from the State Department like that, which under normal circumstances would be considered U.S. government policy. And then the next day to have something contradicting it by the President of the United States. I don't know what happened, but I've had the experience at an international meeting recently of speaking with a British government defense representative who was trying to convince me about the Chagos deal and what a great deal it was and how it was the best deal they could possibly have. So I had the experience very similar to what a State Department person would have had. First of all, the British accent doesn't impress me as much as it may some in the US. So we'll take that off the table. But I have seen people think anybody with a British accent is a Churchillian genius. And I wouldn't discount that from the effect of the arguments. He was just giving me, to be generous, incomplete information. And because it was a topic that I happened to know, the back and forth we had to be taken apart. Somebody came in and kind of pulled me away because, I didn't just buy it. And what was also clear was he didn't know about the precedent of how the U.S. wound down the trust territory of the Pacific Islands, which was a very similar situation, and the U.S. handled it completely differently. And because the U.S. had control over, at the end of World War II, the old Japanese possessions. Those reverted to the United Nations. They were given to the UN to administer as this trust territory. But the U.S. didn't want to be a colonial power, but they needed security for that zone. And so what the U.S. did was referendum for everybody involved. They set up a Congress of Micronesia. They debated it for years about potential outcomes, whether they wanted to become part of the United States, like the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas eventually did, whether they wanted to go independent but have a compact of free association, like eventually Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, and Marshall Islands did. But in the U.S., and this is, I think, gets to a core difference between the U.S. and the U.K. In the U.S., sovereignty lies in the individual. In the UK, it lies in the crown. So you can have a transfer of sovereignty that involves a transfer of land without respect to the sovereignty of the individual. So I think that's why it's so hard for people who are used to the US system to understand how the UK can just transfer over. It's very similar to Hong Kong. I never understood why the UK didn't offer the people of Hong Kong a referendum on their future. The agreement that had been signed between Hong Kong and China was pre-Communist Party China. It wasn't the Chinese government that was in power then. Why did they have to stick to that agreement? Why couldn't they offer the sovereign people of Hong Kong of a choice in their future? Again, if we're looking at kind of macro issues, an acknowledgement that the American way of the sovereignty lying in the individual is really, I think, the only viable way that gets you around any of the legal arguments, regardless, but also it's the morally correct thing to do.
Would both of you speak to this issue of the Brits preventing the United States from using their facilities to position aircraft or, I guess, other assets in part of this buildup of forces that the president has brought to bear against the possibility that some deal with Iran is not going to be forthcoming, or perhaps as at the very least, a catalyst to trying to get the Iranian government to make such a deal. Should we start with you, Christopher? What your thoughts are on that? Would that constitute at a minimum a precedent, and at worst, in some way, impinge upon our use of not a facility on the home British Isles, but out in the Indian Ocean? Diego Garcia.
Well, the problem goes back a number of sort of years in the UK, back to sort of the time of the Iraq War. I mean, we in the UK, unlike some countries, international law is separate, and then you have domestic law. But at the time of the sort of Iraq War, the idea that sort of wars had to be legal internationally, and you had the whole sort of rigmarole during the Iraq War of trying to get an Attorney General's opinion to say that the Iraq War was legal, which in my mind is entirely the wrong question. You probably should decide whether a war is a good idea before you decide whether it's legal. But this insertion of lawyers into the decisions on military action, we had that, and then sort of in wars sort of since then. And now with this whole sort of legal body of, we have our Attorney General Hermer, who's a sort of left-wing human rights lawyer, and of course Starmer himself. their entire sort of way of looking at the world is law and their particular flavor of law, this sort of left-wing law. So this idea that we can't use our own defense forces, our own army, our own bases, or let somebody else use the bases unless some legal test has been made. This is this has crept in over the last few years, and it's very damaging. So I think we saw it a year or so ago in the Caribbean, where Lord Hermer was apparently insisting on not sharing intelligence with the United States in case it was used to target boats carrying drugs, which I'm quite in favor of targeting boats carrying drugs personally. But if you're a human rights lawyer, you that have spent your career suing British soldiers for their part in military action, or suing on behalf of clients, this is very dangerous. So I'm presuming this is the sort of thinking that has gone across the cabinet table in number 10, that America's asked us to use, if they can use these bases. The answer should always be yes, because it's Britain's most important alliance, and Iran is not a country that is any friend of ours. So that should be the logical solution. But if you've got a prime minister who's spent their career suing on behalf of people against soldiers and against Britain, his default reaction would be, is this legal? And then you get into all of these arguments, which I think is hinted at in Trump's Truth Social post using RAF Fairford. Britain is also at risk from Iran. So it's trying to build yes, there's a self-defense case to attack Iran because they have weapons of mass destruction, trying to build that legal case. Presumably, Starmer and Hermer haven't been convinced of that case, which is he's entirely the wrong person to be the Attorney General. And an Attorney General should not be deciding, in my opinion, matters of war and peace and military action to start with. So I'm afraid that's where we've ended up. It's not a very good place, I'm afraid, but there's always hope things can change.
So, Cleo, just to put a finer point on this, I get the problems with the policy vis-a-vis British facilities, on the home islands, but what about this applying to Diego Garcia? Is that in prospect, do you think, or is that, again, something that could well be a knock-on effect of this kind of deal making, especially if, God forbid, the base is turned over to Mauritius?
I have no idea. I mean, I think that the fundamental point is what was just brought up, which is that trust has been broken, or isn't there. There's a part of the agreement between the UK and Mauritius that says Mauritius has to be advised in I can't remember the term, but it's sort of timely fashion if the base is going to be used. What's the wording, Mr. Howarth?
If forces emanating from the Chagos archipelago, they need to be notified expeditiously. And you can argue about what this means, and then the British government says, oh, well, that means we can tell you afterwards, so there's no problem. But then what happens if it's a 6-month campaign? At what point do you have to tell Mauritius that drones are being launched to attack terrorists in Yemen or Iran? I mean, the whole thing is nonsense. And Mauritius is highly compromised by Huawei and Chinese phone hacking. There's been a number of reported scandals on it. So as soon as you tell the Mauritian government, you've told the world, or told China anyway. Yeah. And you can say, well, you could trust British officials, well, not to do this. Well, British officials, it seems, go by the letter of the law, and you couldn't trust a future government. They'll look at the agreement and say, well, we've signed up to telling Mauritius expeditiously of that, and who knows what their lawyers will interpret. So it's just not a good idea having it in writing or having a commitment that is unclear, because someone in the future might interpret it in a way that we wouldn't interpret it.
Well, this is less of a celebratory program than I had thought it would be, and I hope that it may yet be one in which we can say that the President of the United States has decisively acted to quash this agreement, and that it will apply not only to Diego Garcia, but also to the rest of the Chagos archipelago, and that we will not find in the days ahead either the British government or the Mauritian government enabled to interpose objections to the use of the Diego Garcia facility, as it must be for our vital national security interests. I want to thank both Colonel Grant Newsham, Christopher Howarth, and Cleo Pascal for joining us to examine the various moving parts to what is an ongoing story. And I very much hope that we will find in the near future the opportunity to both pull in some of the people who are now actually holding physically the one of the islands of the Chagos to try to complicate further deterioration in our positions there, as well as those of you, especially in Britain, who have been trying to hold the line as well. As the president indicated in his Truth Social posting yesterday, but paraphrase him, pretty clear that the Brits will rue the day if they do go forward with this. And as Cleo, you and Colonel Newsham both indicated, there may well be further consequences for an important alliance relationship if they do, not least with respect to sharing intelligence, as we have done assiduously for 4 or 5 decades now at least. So I want to say again, Cleo, particularly to you, thank you for elevating this issue so powerfully and consistently and tenaciously. And I know when we talked last night that we were both quite buoyed by the president's post, as I'm sure were you, Christopher, and your team. And we look forward to an excuse to pop the champagne corks here in the near future if he will continue to impress upon the British government that they must not give up Diego Garcia or the islands that surround it, that would, if compromised by the Chinese Communist Party, deal a real body blow to American power projection in that immediate region of the Indo-Pacific, as well as much farther afield as well. So with that, let me say thank you to you all as well in the audience. I hope that you have found this to be informative as well as thought-provoking in terms of where are we going to find ourselves down this road if it continues to unfold as radicals in Perfidious Albion have their way. We pray that will not be the case. God bless you all. God bless America. And we will sign out. Over and out.